I stood in the elevator, watching the numbers climb toward the executive floor. In my hand was a contract that would change everything, the final papers to acquire Westmore Solutions, my parents' company. They had no idea I was the anonymous buyer who had been negotiating with their board for months. Today, they would finally learn that the daughter they had dismissed as unfocused and lacking business acumen now owned the very legacy they had refused to share with me. My name is Alexandra Reed, and today I would finally prove my worth to the parents who never believed I could succeed. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The boardroom of Westmore Solutions exuded power, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline, an imposing mahogany table stretching the length of the room, and the company's distinctive blue logo emblazoned on the wall. As I waited for the board members and executives to arrive, I straightened my tailored navy suit and touched the simple gold pendant at my neck, my grandmother's, the only family member who had truly believed in me. I had deliberately arrived, 15 minutes early. I wanted to experience this moment of calm before the storm, to breathe in the significance of what I was about to do. The leather portfolio on the table before me contained documents representing months of strategic planning, years of building my own business success, and a lifetime of nursing the quiet determination to prove my parents wrong. The receptionist had shown me in without recognition. I had changed significantly since my last appearance at Westmore headquarters 7 years ago. Gone was the uncertain 23-year-old with desperate eyes pleading for a chance. In her place stood a successful entrepreneur with 3 thriving businesses and the resources to acquire a company valued at $87 million. My hair was shorter now, my posture more confident, my eyes reflecting hard-won wisdom rather than desperate need for approval. My thoughts drifted back to the moment that had set this journey in motion. I had just graduated with my MBA, filled with ambitious ideas about modernizing my family's company, bringing its old-school consulting services into the digital age, expanding into emerging markets, implementing the innovative strategies I'd spent years studying. I had prepared a comprehensive presentation for my parents, Margaret and Richard Reed, convinced they would recognize my potential value to the company their own parents had founded. "This is not how we do things at Westmore," my mother had said, coolly after I finished my presentation. She sat behind her massive desk, not a hair out of place in her perfectly styled silver bob, her expression revealing neither approval nor interest. "These ideas show exactly why you're not ready for a position of responsibility here." My father had been even more dismissive. "Alexandra, business isn't about flashy new concepts and disruption. It's about stability, tradition, and measured growth. Qualities you've never demonstrated." His voice carried the same patronizing tone he'd used throughout my childhood when explaining why my younger brother Jackson was naturally gifted, while I was merely trying too hard. "I have an MBA from Wharton," I had argued, struggling to keep my voice steady. "I graduated top of my class. All I'm asking for is a chance to prove myself." "An academic degree doesn't translate to business acumen," my mother replied. "We've discussed this as a family. Jackson will be joining the executive track after he completes his degree. You should look elsewhere for opportunities more suitable to your abilities." The subtext was clear. My brother, still an undergraduate at the time, was the anointed heir to the Westmore legacy. I was the disappointment, the daughter who would never measure up regardless of my credentials or ideas. What would be suitable? "For me exactly?" I had asked, unable to mask the hurt in my voice. My father had sighed, the sound weighted with decades of disappointment. "Something less demanding, perhaps. Event planning? Marketing? Something that would allow you to maintain a work-life balance." The implication that I lacked the stamina and intelligence for real business leadership hung in the air between us. My mother had added the final blow. Alexandra, you need to be realistic about your capabilities. Not everyone is cut out for executive leadership. There's no shame in recognizing your limitations. I had left their office that day with burning eyes and a hollow chest. But something else had kindled inside me. A quiet, smoldering determination that would eventually transform into the most powerful, motivating force of my life. The sound of voices in the hallway pulled me back to the present. I took a deep breath and stood as the boardroom door opened. First came the current CEO, Thomas Blackwood, followed by various board members and executives I recognized from my research. Then, walking side by side as they had throughout their 40-year marriage and business partnership, entered my parents. Neither looked directly at me at first, assuming I was simply another advisor in the acquisition process. Thomas made the introductions. Margaret, Richard, this is Alexandra Reed, CEO of Horizon Ventures and the representative of our acquirer. My mother's perfectly composed expression faltered first. Her eyes widened slightly, her step halted mid-stride. My father's reaction was more dramatic, color draining from his face as recognition dawned, followed by confusion. Alexandra? He spoke my name as if testing its sound, unsure if he was hallucinating. Hello, father. Mother. I kept my voice level, professional. Shall we begin? We have a transaction to complete. The next 2 hours proceeded with surreal formality. I presented the final terms of the acquisition: generous retention packages for key employees, assurances about maintaining the Westmore brand within the larger structure of my holding company, and clear transition plans. Throughout the presentation, I directed my comments to the entire board, careful not to focus exclusively on my parents despite their stunned expressions. My mother recovered her composure first, attempting to reassert control. These terms seem hastily conceived. Perhaps we should postpone signing until we've had more time to review. The board has already approved the terms, Mrs. Reed, Thomas interjected. The due diligence period ended last month. Today is merely the formal signing. But who exactly is acquiring us? My father demanded, looking at me with naked disbelief. Alexandra, are you merely representing the actual purchaser? It was the moment I had rehearsed countless times in my mind. I smiled slightly and reached into my portfolio, removing the ownership structure documentation. Horizon Ventures is my holding company, father. I founded it 5 years ago after successfully building and selling 2 technology companies. I am the majority shareholder and sole decision-maker regarding this acquisition. In short, I am purchasing Westmore Solutions. The silence that followed was profound. My mother's perfectly manicured hand trembled slightly as she reached for her water glass. My father's face had progressed from pale shock to flushed discomfort. The board members exchanged glances, clearly aware of the family drama unfolding before them, but professional enough not to comment. This is unexpected, my mother finally managed, her voice lacking its usual authoritative tone. I imagine it is, I replied calmly. Though perhaps it shouldn't be. You've always taught me the importance of seizing strategic opportunities when they arise. Westmore's market position has been weakening for the past 3 years. Your failure to adapt to changing industry demands has made the company vulnerable. It was the perfect time to acquire a business with strong fundamentals but outdated leadership. My clinical assessment landed like a physical blow. My father's jaw tightened, a familiar sign of his anger. You've orchestrated this entire situation. As some sort of revenge? Not revenge, father. Investment. Westmore has a strong foundation and valuable client relationships. With proper modernization and strategic restructuring, I project a 30% growth in revenue within 18 months. I slid the signing papers toward them. The board has approved the sale. Your signatures are the final requirement to complete the transaction. My mother stared at the documents, then at me. For the first time in my life, I saw something new in her eyes, not disappointment or judgment, but uncertainty. Perhaps even respect. "You've planned this for years," she said. It wasn't a question. I maintained eye contact. "I've built my career and investment strategy carefully, yes. The opportunity to acquire Westmore presented itself 9 months ago when your Q3 results prompted a drop in valuation, and you kept your identity hidden throughout the negotiations," my father stated, his business mind finally engaging beyond the personal shock. It seemed prudent. I wanted the transaction evaluated on its business merits, not complicated by family dynamics. The meeting concluded with signatures and handshakes, formalities observed despite the emotional undercurrents. As the board members filed out, offering congratulations on the completed deal, my parents remained seated, clearly waiting for a private moment. When the door closed behind the last board member, my father spoke first. "Why, Alexandra? To humiliate us? To prove a point?" I gathered my documents slowly, considering my response. The question deserved honesty, not the corporate language I had hidden behind during the formal proceedings. "7 years ago, you told me I wasn't cut out for executive leadership, that I should recognize my limitations." I met his gaze directly. I chose instead to recognize my potential. Everything I've built myself, without the family name, without your connections, without the safety net you provided Jackson. "We were trying to protect you," my mother said, her voice softer than I had heard it in years. "The business world is brutal, especially for women. We didn't think you had the temperament for it." I laughed, the sound surprising even me. "Yet here we are. I've just acquired your company in a transaction valued at $87 million. I'd say my temperament served me quite well." "What happens now?" my father asked, an unfamiliar vulnerability in his voice. "Will you dismantle what we've built? Replace the management team? Change the company name?" The questions revealed his deepest fears, not just for his position or legacy, but for the business he had devoted his life to building. In that moment, I saw something I had missed in my years of determination to prove him wrong. My father genuinely loved this company. "Westmore has a strong foundation and valuable institutional knowledge," I said, softening my tone slightly. "I didn't acquire it to dismantle it, but to revitalize it. The management team will remain largely intact, with some strategic additions to address digital transformation needs. The name stays." Relief flickered across his features before caution returned. "And our positions?" This was the question I had contemplated most during my planning. The vindictive part of me had initially imagined removing them immediately, a perfect symmetry to their rejection of me. But as my plan had progressed, as I had built my own success and confidence, that need for petty revenge had diminished. "You'll both transition to advisory board positions," I stated. "Your institutional knowledge and client relationships remain valuable. However, operational decision-making will shift to a new executive team that I'll assemble." My mother nodded, slowly processing the demotion with remarkable composure. "And Jackson? He's been serving as VP of Client Relations for the past 2 years. "Jackson will be evaluated like any other executive," I replied. "If his performance metrics justify his position, he'll remain. If not, he'll be offered a different role or a generous severance package." My father leaned forward, studying me with new eyes. "You've thought of everything, haven't you?" "That's what CEOs do, Father. We anticipate challenges, plan for contingencies, and make difficult decisions based on data rather than emotion." I stood, gathering my portfolio. "There will be a company-wide announcement tomorrow morning. I'd appreciate your presence to demonstrate a united front during the transition." As I reached the door, my mother called out, "Alexandra." I turned, one hand on the doorknob. She hesitated, then asked, "How did you do it? Build all this so quickly without anyone knowing?" The question contained genuine curiosity, perhaps the first time she had ever expressed real interest in my capabilities. I considered deflecting, maintaining the professional distance I had carefully cultivated. Instead, I decided to offer a glimpse of the journey. I started small, with a digital marketing consultancy that specialized in helping traditional businesses transition to e-commerce. I worked 18-hour days, lived in a studio apartment, and reinvested every dollar of profit. When my first company reached $3 million in annual revenue, I sold it to a larger agency. I used that capital to launch a fintech startup focused on payment processing for small businesses. That company grew faster, reaching $25 million valuation within 2 years. After selling it, I established Horizon Ventures as a holding company for strategic acquisitions. "All this in 7 years," my father murmured, shaking his head in disbelief. "When you're told you'll never amount to anything, you become very motivated to prove otherwise," I replied, allowing a hint of the old hurt to surface briefly. "The board meeting for transition planning is scheduled for 9 a.m. tomorrow. I'll see you both then." As I walked out of the boardroom and back to the elevator, my shoulders finally relaxed from their perfect posture. The weight of 7 years of planning, working, and waiting lifted with each step. I had done it. Not just acquired their company, but forced them to see me clearly for perhaps the first time in my life. In the privacy of the elevator, I allowed myself a moment of pure, uncomplicated satisfaction. The girl who wasn't cut out for executive leadership now controlled a business empire worth over $100 million. The daughter who should accept her limitations had just demonstrated that her only real limitation had been their perception of her potential. But as the elevator descended, so did the momentary high of vindication. I realized that despite the meticulous planning of this moment, I hadn't fully anticipated how it would feel. The satisfaction was there, certainly, but mixed with it was something unexpected, a certain emptiness where the driving force of proving them wrong had resided for so long. For 7 years, their dismissal had fueled my ambition, pushed me through exhaustion, doubt, and failure. Now that I had achieved the ultimate proof of my capabilities, what would drive me forward? Who would I become when I was no longer defined by the need to prove my parents wrong? As I exited the building into the bright afternoon sunlight, I realized this wasn't an ending, but another beginning. The most meaningful validation hadn't come from my parents' shocked expressions or the ownership papers in my portfolio. It had come from the journey itself, from building businesses that created value, from developing my own leadership philosophy, from discovering strengths I never knew I possessed. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I had spent 7 years proving myself to them. Perhaps it was time to discover who I could become when I was building for myself alone. My car waited at the curb, my driver opening the door as I approached. "Where to, Ms. Reed?" I smiled, a genuine expression that felt foreign on this day of carefully controlled emotions. "Horizon headquarters. We have a new acquisition to integrate." The real work, and the real opportunity, was just beginning. The morning after acquiring Westmore Solutions dawned crisp and clear, the kind of perfect autumn day that typically energized me. I had always been a morning person, using the quiet hours before dawn to strategize, exercise, and prepare for whatever challenges the day might bring. This morning was different. I had barely slept, my mind cycling through the events of the previous day and anticipating the company-wide announcement scheduled for 9:30 a.m. My penthouse apartment offered stunning views of the city skyline, the same skyline visible from the Westmore boardroom, though from a different angle. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, coffee in hand, watching the sun illuminate the glass towers of the financial district. Somewhere in that gleaming landscape, my parents were likely experiencing a similarly sleepless morning, perhaps discussing strategies to maintain dignity during the transition, or possibly questioning every interaction they'd ever had with me, searching for signs of the ambition and capability they had failed to recognize. My phone chimed with a message from Eliza, my COO at Horizon Ventures, and the only person who had known the full extent of my plan to acquire Westmore. Car will pick you up at 8:15. PR team has prepared your announcement remarks. Board members have all confirmed attendance. How are you feeling about today? The question gave me pause. How was I feeling? The triumph I had anticipated for so long felt muted, overshadowed by a creeping uncertainty about what would come next. I had defined myself in opposition to my parents for so long. What would it mean to suddenly be their superior, holding power over their professional futures? Ready, I texted back, avoiding the more complex truth. See you at the office at 8:30. I dressed with particular care, selecting a crimson sheath dress that projected both authority and confidence, paired with the black Louboutin heels I reserved for decisive moments. The color choice was deliberate. Red had always been my mother's least favorite color on me, claiming it clashed with my auburn hair and made me look too bold. Today, boldness was precisely what I intended to project. At precisely 8:30, I walked into Horizon's headquarters, a modern space of glass, steel, and strategic splashes of color that reflected the company's innovative yet disciplined approach. Unlike Westmore's traditional wood-paneled gravitas, Horizon embraced light, transparency, and collaborative spaces alongside private areas for focused work. The design reflected my leadership philosophy, clarity of purpose balanced with flexibility of approach. Eliza met me in the lobby, tablet in hand, her usual efficient self. At 38, she was 7 years my senior, but had never shown any resentment about working for a younger CEO. We had met during my first venture, when she had been a consultant helping me establish proper operational procedures. Her methodical approach had complemented my visionary tendencies, and when I founded Horizon, she was the first person I had recruited. The team is assembled in the strategy room, she said after greeting me. Legal has the final integration, documents prepared, HR has the retention packages organized, and communications has drafted the all-hands announcement. Thomas from Westmore called to confirm that their staff has been notified of a mandatory meeting at 9:30, though the reason hasn't been disclosed. And my parents? Arrived at Westmore headquarters at 7:45 this morning. Thomas reports they seem composed and have been in their respective offices since arrival. I nodded, absorbing the information. Any last-minute issues I should be aware of? Nothing critical. Jackson Reed called the Westmore legal team 3 times last night attempting to get information about the acquisition. He apparently wasn't included in the board meeting yesterday. This was no surprise. Despite being groomed as the heir apparent, Jackson had never shown much interest in the operational details of the family business. At 30, my younger brother had enjoyed all the advantages I had been denied: executive training, mentorship from our parents, automatic respect from the Westmore team, yet had leveraged these opportunities into a middling career marked more by family connection than actual achievement. He'll get the same information as everyone else at the announcement, I replied, stepping into the elevator. What's the status on our restructuring team? On standby. Diana will lead the technology integration. Marcus will handle operational assessment. And Samir is prepared for the financial systems merger. They can begin work immediately following the announcement. The next hour passed in a blur of final preparations, reviewing announcement remarks, confirming integration timelines, addressing last-minute questions from the Horizon leadership team. At 9:15, my executive team and I boarded the company, cars that would transport us to Westmore headquarters, located just 12 blocks from Horizon's more modern offices. As our small convoy navigated the morning traffic, I felt a momentary vertigo, a strange sense of traveling backward and forward, in time simultaneously. I was returning to the building I had left in humiliation 7 years ago, but returning as its owner rather than its supplicant. The person I had been then could scarcely have imagined this moment, Yet every decision I had made since had led precisely here. We arrived with 10 minutes to spare. Thomas Blackwood met us in the lobby, his expression a mixture of professional courtesy and personal uncertainty. As CEO, he had led the negotiations from Westmore's side, unaware until yesterday that the anonymous buyer was the daughter of the company's founders. "Ms. Reed," he greeted me with a formal handshake. "Everything is prepared as requested. The staff is assembled in the main conference center on the second floor. The board and executive team are waiting in the preparation room adjacent to it." "Thank you, Thomas. I appreciate your professionalism during this transition." I meant it sincerely. Thomas had been hired after my departure and had no part in my parents' decision to exclude me from the company. By all accounts, he was a competent, if somewhat conventional leader who had maintained Westmore's reputation while failing to innovate sufficiently to prevent its gradual decline. "Will there be a role for me moving forward?" he asked directly as he escorted us toward the elevators. I appreciated his candor. "Yes. We'll discuss specifics later today, but I value your institutional knowledge and client relationships. This acquisition isn't about wholesale replacement of leadership, but strategic enhancement and modernization." Relief flickered across his features. "Thank you for that clarity." The preparation room fell silent as we entered. The Westmore board members and executive team stood in small clusters, conversations halting mid-sentence. My parents were positioned near the windows, my father's hand resting protectively on my mother's shoulder in a rare public display of affection. Both were impeccably dressed, armor-like in their perfect presentation. And then there was Jackson, pacing by the Mao coffee service, his typically casual demeanor replaced by barely contained agitation. He stopped abruptly when he saw me, his expression cycling rapidly through confusion, disbelief, and anger. "Alexandra, what the hell is going on?" he demanded, striding toward me. "Why am I hearing rumors that Westmore has been sold? Why wasn't I informed about yesterday's board meeting?" Our parents had clearly chosen not to tell him about my role in the acquisition. Interesting. "The information wasn't selectively withheld from you, Jackson," I replied calmly. "The acquisition negotiations were conducted under standard confidentiality agreements. The board was informed when legally required, and the general staff will be informed momentarily." I turned to address the entire room. "We'll be making the announcement in 5 minutes. I'd appreciate everyone's presence on stage to demonstrate unity during this transition." "Unity?" Jackson's voice rose incredulously. "You expect unity when you've orchestrated some kind of hostile takeover of our family's company?" "It wasn't hostile," my father interjected, speaking for the first time since my arrival. "The board voted unanimously to accept the offer. The terms are more than fair." Jackson turned to him in disbelief. "You knew about this? You agreed to it?" "We learned of Alexandra's involvement only yesterday, at the final signing," my mother explained, her voice maintaining its usual composure, despite the circumstance. The decision had already been made at that point. Jackson's face flushed with the quick temper he had never quite learned to control. "This is insane. She hasn't been part of this company, hasn't been part of this family in any meaningful way for years, and suddenly she's, what? Our boss?" The room fell uncomfortably silent. The executives and board members studiously avoided eye contact, unwilling to be drawn into the family drama unfolding before them. Eliza stepped slightly closer to me, a subtle show of support. "This isn't the time or place for this discussion," I said firmly. "We have an announcement to make to 300 employees who are currently waiting to learn about their professional futures. We can address family matters privately afterward." Before Jackson could respond, Thomas intervened. Smoothly, "We should proceed to the conference center. Everyone, please follow me." Walking onto the stage before Westmore's assembled staff was surreal. Faces I recognized from my brief post-MBA internship 7 years ago were now older, some in more senior positions, others seemingly unchanged by time. Newer employees regarded me with simple curiosity, unaware of the history that made this moment so significant. The announcement itself was straightforward. Thomas introduced me as the CEO of Horizon Ventures, which had acquired Westmore Solutions, in a friendly transaction approved unanimously by the board. I then outlined the broad vision for the integration, maintaining Westmore's core consulting strengths while expanding into digital services, preserving the brand while modernizing. Its approach, retaining valuable team members while bringing in strategic new talent. Change can be unsettling, I acknowledged near the end of my remarks, but it also creates opportunity. Westmore has a proud legacy of client service excellence. Together with Horizon's innovative approaches, we can build something that honors that legacy while creating new possibilities for growth, advancement, and impact. I look forward to working with each of you during this transition and beyond. The applause that followed was polite but reserved, as expected. These employees had just learned their company had been acquired. Enthusiasm would require demonstrated commitment to the promises I had made. I introduced my integration team, outlined the immediate next steps, and assured everyone that individual departments would receive more detailed information throughout the day. As the staff dispersed, murmuring quietly among themselves, I turned to find Jackson standing directly behind me, his expression thunderous. "We need to talk," he said in a low voice. "Now." My parents approached more cautiously, my father placing a restraining hand on Jackson's arm. "Perhaps we should move this discussion to a more private location," he suggested, glancing meaningfully at the curious glances being directed our way. "My office," my mother said decisively. "It's closest." Minutes later, the four of us were enclosed in my mother's meticulously organized office, its decor unchanged from my last visit years ago. The same muted color scheme, the same carefully curated art featuring geometric abstracts, the same precisely arranged family photos showing a narrative of perfect family harmony that had never matched reality. Jackson wasted no time once the door closed. "How long have you been planning this?" he demanded. "Has this been your goal all along? To waltz back in here and take over what should have been my birthright?" "Your birthright?" I repeated, unable to keep a note of incredulity from my voice. Interesting choice of words for a publicly traded company with shareholders, a board of directors, and fiduciary responsibilities. "You know what I mean," he snapped. "Mom and Dad were grooming me to take over eventually. I've been working my way up, learning every aspect of the business. Then you swoop in with some tech bro money and buy it out from under me? First, I'm clearly not a tech bro," I replied dryly. Second, Westmore was underperforming the market by 17% over the past 3 years. The board had a responsibility to shareholders to consider acquisition offers. The fact that they unanimously accepted my bid suggests they recognize the value proposition. "This isn't about market performance or value propositions," Jackson argued. "This is about you trying to prove something. You've always been obsessed with showing you're smarter than everyone else, that you deserve more attention, more recognition." My mother sighed, the sound laden with exhaustion. "That's enough, Jackson. What's done is done. Alexandra has acquired the company legally. The question now is how we move forward." "Move forward?" Jackson looked at her incredulously. "You're just accepting this? After everything you've invested in preparing me to lead?" My father spoke up, his voice carrying the authoritative tone that had once intimidated me. "Your mother is right. The transaction is complete. The professional thing to do now is to ensure a smooth transition for the sake of the employees, who depend on this company for their livelihoods." Jackson stared at him in disbelief. "I can't believe this. You're siding with her after she blindsided all of us?" "We're not siding with anyone," my mother interjected. "We're acknowledging reality and attempting to handle it with dignity." She turned to me, her expression carefully neutral. Alexandra, what role do you envision for Jackson in the restructured organization? The question surprised me, not its content, but the implicit acknowledgement of my authority to determine my brother's professional future. Even in this moment of dramatic power reversal, my mother remained pragmatic. That depends on Jackson, I replied honestly. All executives will be evaluated based on performance metrics, client feedback, and team management capabilities. Those who meet or exceed expectations will have opportunities to grow within the expanded organization. Those who don't will be offered alternative positions or separation packages. You're going to evaluate me? Jackson's laugh was harsh. Based on what expertise? You've never worked in management consulting a day in your life. I've built and sold 2 successful companies and now run a venture firm with 7 portfolio companies across multiple industries, I countered. I understand organizational effectiveness, leadership capability, and performance metrics. The evaluation will be fair but thorough. My father cleared his throat. And our roles? You mentioned advisory positions yesterday. Yes, I believe your institutional knowledge and client relationships remain valuable assets. I'm proposing 1-year contracts as senior advisors, with specific responsibilities focused on client retention and knowledge transfer. I opened my tablet and pulled up the relevant documents. The terms are generous, though obviously a change from your current positions. My mother accepted the tablet, scanning the contract with the quick comprehension that had made her a formidable business leader. The compensation is fair, she acknowledged after a moment. The role is primarily client-facing with limited operational authority. That's correct. So we become figureheads, my father said, his tone reflecting the bitterness he was clearly trying to suppress. Trotted out for client meetings but removed from real decision-making. You retain influence through your advisory capacity, I clarified. Your recommendations will be valued, particularly regarding long-standing client relationships. But yes, operational decisions will shift to the new executive team. Jackson paced the office, running his hands through his hair in frustration. This is ridiculous. We should be fighting this, not negotiating the terms of our professional demotions. My mother fixed him with a stern look. Enough, Jackson. This display is beneath you and unhelpful to our current situation. She turned back to me. When do these changes take effect? The new organizational structure will be announced next Monday. Your transition to advisory roles begins immediately, though we'll present it publicly as a planned succession rather than a result of the acquisition. To save face, my father observed with a hint of surprise. You're offering us a dignified narrative. The company benefits from stability during transition, I replied. Portraying this as a hostile removal of leadership would create unnecessary anxiety among clients and staff. My mother studied me with new intensity. When did you become so pragmatic about business optics? The Alexandra I remember was always pushing for radical transparency, advocating for disruption over diplomacy. The question caught me off guard. It was the first time she had expressed genuine curiosity about my professional evolution rather than simply judging my capabilities. Experience, I answered after a moment. Building companies teaches you quickly about the practical value of perception management. Transparency matters, but so does stability. A silence fell over the room as the reality of our new relationship continued to settle. For the first time in my adult life, I held the power in this family dynamic. The parents who had dismissed my potential now reported to me. The brother who had been granted every opportunity I had been denied now awaited my evaluation of his professional worth. It should have felt vindicating. Instead, it felt strangely hollow. I have meetings scheduled with department heads beginning at 11:30, I said, breaking the silence. The PR team will distribute the transition narrative to key clients by end of day. I'd appreciate your support in maintaining a unified message during this period. My mother nodded. the consummate professional even in this moment of personal reckoning. "We'll do what's best for the company, of course." "The company," Jackson repeated with bitter emphasis. Suddenly it's not our legacy or our family's achievement, but just the company, because it's not ours anymore, is it? It's hers. He gestured toward me with undisguised resentment. "It's a business, Jackson," my father said wearily. "It's always been a business, even when we owned it. Your mother and I may have made mistakes in how we approached succession planning, but the fundamental reality remains. Businesses change hands. Leadership transitions. Those who can't adapt are left behind." The implicit acknowledgement of their mistake, their failure to recognize my potential, hung in the air between us. It wasn't an apology, not exactly, but it was the closest my father had ever come to admitting an error in judgment where I was concerned. My mother rose from her chair, smoothing her already immaculate skirt in a gesture I recognized from childhood. Her way of physically resetting when emotions threatened her composure. "Alexandra, we'll review these contracts and respond by tomorrow morning. In the meantime, we'll support the transition narrative as requested." She paused, then added with careful formality, "Congratulations on building the resources and strategic vision to accomplish this acquisition. It's impressive." Coming from Margaret Reed, this constituted effusive praise. I nodded in acknowledgement, maintaining the professional distance that now defined our interaction. "Thank you. I look forward to working together in this new capacity." As I gathered my tablet and prepared to leave for my next meeting, Jackson moved to block my path. "This isn't over," he said quietly, his voice containing none of the bluster from earlier, replaced by something colder and more determined. "You may own the company now, but this family dynamic, the history between us, that's not something you can resolve with contracts and press releases." I met his gaze directly. "You're right. But that's a separate issue from the business transition we're currently managing. I suggest we focus on professional matters now and address personal history when emotions aren't running quite so high." "Always so rational," he replied with a hollow laugh. "Always compartmentalizing. But you didn't buy Westmore as a purely rational business decision, did you, Alexandra? This was personal. Don't pretend otherwise." His words struck uncomfortably, close to truth. The acquisition made sound business sense. Westmore had valuable client relationships, strong fundamentals, and significant potential for growth with the right modernization strategy. But I couldn't honestly claim that personal motivation had played no role in my decision to pursue this particular company among the many acquisition targets Horizon had considered. "The business case was sound," I replied carefully. "The personal satisfaction is merely a secondary benefit." Jackson's expression suggested he didn't believe me for a moment, but he stepped aside, allowing me to exit the office that would soon no longer belong to our mother. As I walked down the hallway toward my next meeting, I felt the weight of what I had accomplished and what remained to be resolved. I had proven my professional worth beyond any reasonable doubt. I had claimed the corporate kingdom that had once rejected me. I had forced acknowledgement of my capabilities from the very people who had once defined me by my limitations. Yet the victory felt incomplete, the vindication less satisfying than I had anticipated during those long years of planning and preparation. Perhaps because at their core, the questions that had driven me remained unanswered. Why hadn't they believed in me? What had they seen, or failed to see, that led them to dismiss my potential so completely? And now that I had definitively proven them wrong, what would define my purpose moving forward? These questions would need to wait. For now, there was a company to transform, employees looking for leadership during uncertainty, and a legacy to reshape according to my vision, rather than my parents'. The personal reckoning with my family might feel unresolved, but the professional path forward was crystal clear. I stepped into the conference room where the department heads awaited, their expressions ranging from curiosity to apprehension to cautious optimism. "Thank you all for making time for this meeting," I began, setting aside family dynamics to focus on the business challenge before me. Today marks the beginning of a new chapter for Westmore Solutions. Let's talk about how we'll write it together. The first month following the acquisition unfolded with relentless intensity. Days blurred into one another as I divided my time between Horizon's ongoing operations and Westmore's integration challenges. 18-hour workdays became my norm, fueled by purpose and the pressing need to prove that my acquisition hadn't been merely a personal vendetta, but a sound business decision. By the third week, Westmore's employees had sorted themselves into 3 distinct camps: the enthusiastic early adopters who embraced the changes I was implementing, the wait-and-see pragmatists who performed their duties competently while reserving judgment, and the resistant old guard who viewed every new initiative as an affront to tradition. This last group was smallest but most vocal, often led by executives who had been my parents' longtime allies and who viewed me as an usurper rather than a legitimate leader. I had anticipated this resistance and prepared for it, but experiencing it directly still tested my resolve. Each morning brought a new challenge: passive-aggressive emails questioning implementation timelines, departmental concerns that thinly veiled opposition to change, or sudden emergencies with long-standing clients that mysteriously required my parents' intervention rather than my own. On this particular morning, 4 weeks post-acquisition, I arrived at Westmore headquarters earlier than usual, hoping to review the quarterly projections before the 8 a.m. executive committee meeting. The building was quiet, most employees not due to arrive for another hour. I had grown to appreciate these early moments of solitude in what still felt like somewhat hostile territory. As I rounded the corner toward the executive suite, I was surprised to find the lights already on in the conference room. Through the glass walls, I could see Jackson sitting alone at the table surrounded by spreadsheets and looking uncharacteristically disheveled. His normally perfect hair was ruffled, his tie loosened, and the dark circles under his eyes suggested he might have been there all night. I hesitated, wondering if I should retreat to my office and avoid what would inevitably be an unpleasant interaction. In the month since the acquisition, Jackson had maintained a cold professionalism in group settings, while completely avoiding any one-on-one contact. Our childhood pattern of him receiving preferential treatment had been dramatically reversed. Now he was the one fighting to prove his worth while I held the power to determine his professional future. Before I could decide, he looked up and saw me. Something in his expression, a flash of vulnerability quickly masked by his usual defiance, made me change course. I entered the conference room, setting my laptop on the table. "You're here early," I observed neutrally, "or late, depending on your perspective." His voice carried the rasp of exhaustion. "I've been working on the Miller account presentation, the one you said needed a complete overhaul before Friday's client meeting." I glanced at the materials spread across the table: financial projections, implementation timelines, staffing, models. The work was substantially more detailed than what he had initially presented at last week's review. "Have you been here all night?" He shrugged, the gesture reminiscent of his teenage dismissiveness. "Someone seemed to think my previous work wasn't up to standard. Figured I'd better fix it if I want to keep my job." The bitterness in his tone was unmistakable. I pulled out a chair and sat across from him, taking a moment to review the nearest spreadsheet. The analysis was thorough, the presentation cleaner, the strategic thinking more evident than in his original version. He had clearly put substantial effort into addressing the concerns I had raised. "This looks much improved," I said honestly. "Don't sound so surprised." He gathered the papers into a more organized pile. "Contrary to what you might believe, I didn't get this position solely through nepotism. I am actually capable of competent work." "I never said you weren't capable." I kept my voice even, professional. "I said your initial presentation lacked the depth of analysis this particular client requires. There's a difference." "Right." His laugh held no humor. Just like there's a difference between not being cut out for executive leadership and recognizing your limitations. Our parents were masters of the subtle professional dismissal. Seems you've inherited that particular skill. The comparison stung more than I wanted to admit. Was I becoming what I had resented? Wielding power in the same dismissive way it had once been wielded against me? That wasn't my intention, I said after a moment. My feedback was based on the deliverable, not on you personally. Easy to say when you're the one with all the power. He ran a hand through his already disheveled hair. You know what's ironic? For years I watched them do to you exactly what you're doing to me now. I even felt sorry for you sometimes, the way they constantly moved the goalposts, the way nothing you did was ever quite good enough. I stiffened at his words. This is completely different. Is it? He looked at me directly, the exhaustion in his eyes giving way to something more perceptive. You're evaluating me against standards you never bothered to clearly articulate. You're finding fault with work that was perfectly acceptable before you took over. You're making me constantly prove my worth while making it clear you don't really believe I have any. His assessment was uncomfortably close to how I had felt during those painful early years of my career. Had I unconsciously adopted the very behaviors that had driven me away? The thought was troubling enough to warrant honest reflection rather than defensive rejection. If that's how my feedback has come across, then I need to reconsider my approach, I conceded. The goal isn't to undermine you, Jackson. It's to strengthen the work we deliver to clients. Is it? He leaned forward slightly. Because from where I'm sitting, it feels a lot like payback. Like you're enjoying watching me struggle the way you once did. The accusation landed with uncomfortable accuracy. Had there been a small, wounded part of me that took satisfaction in seeing my golden child brother finally forced to prove himself? The possibility wasn't something I was proud to acknowledge, even silently to myself. This isn't about evening scores, I said, though perhaps with less conviction than I intended. No? He gathered his materials into a folder. Then why did you even want this company, Alexandra? You've built something impressive with Horizon. You had nothing to prove. Yet here you are, micromanaging presentations and second-guessing executives who have been in this industry for decades. If it's not about payback, what is it about? It was a question I had been avoiding since the acquisition, one that probed at motivations deeper and more complex than the clean business rationale I had presented to the board, to my team, to myself. Why had I really pursued Westmore so relentlessly? Was it truly the strategic fit I had claimed, or was it the culmination of a 7-year quest to force recognition from the people who had once dismissed me? Before I could formulate a response that satisfied either of us, the door opened and Eliza entered, tablet in hand and surprise registering briefly on her face at finding Jackson and me in what appeared to be a private conversation. Sorry to interrupt, she said smoothly. Alexandra, the integration team needs your input on the technology migration timeline. There's a conflict between the CRM implementation and the quarterly client review schedule. The moment for honesty, with Jackson and with myself, slipped away, replaced by the immediate demands of business. I'll be right there, I replied, gathering my things. To Jackson, I added, the revisions look good. Let's review the final presentation tomorrow. He nodded, the brief vulnerability I had glimpsed now completely replaced by the professional mask he wore in all our business interactions. I'll have it ready by noon. As I followed Eliza out, I felt the weight of the unfinished conversation. Something important had almost surfaced, a recognition that this acquisition, this triumph I had pursued for so long, carried complications I hadn't fully anticipated. It wasn't the simple vindication narrative I had constructed during those years of building toward this moment. It was messier, more nuanced, and potentially more transformative than a straightforward tale of proving my worth to those who had doubted me. The executive committee meeting that followed was routine in its content, but charged with the undercurrents that had defined Westmore since the acquisition. My parents sat at the far end of the table in their new advisory capacities, offering input when directly questioned, but otherwise maintaining careful professional distance. The departmental heads delivered their updates with varying degrees of enthusiasm or reservation. Jackson arrived last, his rumpled appearance now corrected, though the exhaustion remained evident in his eyes. After the meeting, I was scheduled to meet with Diana, my head of technology integration, to discuss the very timeline issues Eliza had mentioned. As I gathered my notes, my mother approached, her posture as impeccable as always despite the fundamental shift in our professional dynamic. "Alexandra, do you have a moment?" Her tone was carefully neutral, her expression revealing nothing of her thoughts. "I have a meeting in 5 minutes," I replied, "but we can speak briefly." She nodded, waiting until the room had emptied before continuing. "I wanted to discuss the Latimer Group situation. Richard and I had dinner with Warren Latimer last night, a social engagement scheduled months ago. He expressed some concerns about the direction of their account under the new management structure. The Latimer Group was one of Westmore's oldest and most prestigious clients, a multinational manufacturing conglomerate that had been with the firm since my grandfather's time. Warren Latimer and my father had attended the same prep school and maintained both a business relationship and personal friendship for over 40 years. What specific concerns did he raise? I kept my tone professional, though I felt the familiar tension that always accompanied these interactions with my mother. He's uncomfortable with the proposed digital transformation strategy for their supply chain management. He feels it's too aggressive given their organizational culture. She delivered this assessment with the confidence of someone accustomed to having her business judgment accepted without question. The strategy was developed based on comprehensive analysis of their current inefficiencies and competitive landscape, I countered. Their reluctance to modernize is precisely why they've lost market share to more innovative competitors over the past 5 years. Warren values stability and proven approaches, my mother replied. He's built his company on methodical growth and risk management. This strategy asks them to change too much, too quickly. Sometimes significant change is necessary for survival, I said, aware that we were no longer discussing just the Latimer account. Gradual adaptation works in stable environments. Their industry isn't stable anymore. My mother studied me, with the penetrating gaze that had intimidated me throughout my childhood, the look that always made me feel as though she could see my every insecurity, my every weakness. Now, I met it without flinching. "You've always pushed for disruption," she observed. "Even in your earliest business proposals, you advocated for radical rather than incremental change. I used to think it was youthful impatience, a lack of appreciation for the complexities of established systems." "And now," I prompted when she paused, "now I wonder if it was prescience rather than impatience." She said this reluctantly, as if the admission cost her something significant. "The business landscape has changed more dramatically in the past decade than in the previous 3. Perhaps your approach is better suited to the current environment than the incremental strategy your father and I always favored." It was the closest thing to an acknowledgement of my business acumen that she had ever offered, a grudging recognition that perhaps I had seen something they had missed, that my disruptive tendencies might actually be valuable in a rapidly evolving market. "The Latimer strategy isn't disruptive for disruption's sake," I explained, softening my tone slightly in response to her unexpected openness. "It's designed to help them catch up to where they should already be, then build the capabilities to adapt more effectively to future changes. If you'd like to review the complete analysis, I can have the team share their research." She considered this for a moment. "That would be helpful, and perhaps Richard and I could join you for the next client meeting. Warren might be more receptive To change if he sees that we endorse the new direction, even if we're no longer leading it ourselves. The offer surprised me. It was practical, professionally sound, and acknowledged both their continuing value to the firm and the new leadership reality. It was also the first time my mother had volunteered to actively support rather than subtly undermine my authority. "I think that would be beneficial," I agreed. "I'll have my assistant coordinate schedules." She nodded, then hesitated as if considering whether to say more. Finally, she added, "Alexandra, I know this transition hasn't been easy for any of us. But I want you to know that despite our differences, over the years, I always respected your intelligence. What I didn't appreciate was your vision. I'm beginning to think that was a significant error in judgment on my part." The words hung between us, not quite an apology, but an acknowledgement that carried its own weight. 7 years ago, I would have given almost anything to hear my mother admit she had misjudged me. Now, the admission felt important, but somehow less essential than it once had. My sense of worth no longer hinged on her recognition, a realization that was both liberating and slightly melancholy. "Thank you for saying that," I replied simply. "I should get to my next meeting, but let's discuss the Latimer approach further." "Tomorrow." She nodded and moved toward the door, then paused. "One more thing. Jackson mentioned you've requested significant revisions to the Miller presentation. He was in the office all night working on it." I tensed, expecting criticism or accusations of unfairness. Instead, she continued, "It's good for him to be pushed. Richard and I did him no favors by sheltering him from criticism all these years. Perhaps you're giving him what we should have, the opportunity to exceed his own expectations rather than merely satisfy ours." With that surprisingly insightful comment, she left, leaving me to absorb the implications of our interaction. For the first time since the acquisition, I felt a shift in how my parents, or at least my mother, viewed my leadership. Not just as an uncomfortable reality they had to accept, but as a potentially valid alternative to their own approach. The remainder of the day passed in a whirlwind of meetings, decisions, and the 1,000 small interactions that constitute corporate leadership. By evening, I was mentally exhausted, but too restless to head home to my empty penthouse. Instead, I found myself drawn to Horizon's offices, seeking the comfort of the space I had designed, the company I had built from nothing, the achievement that was undeniably and solely mine. The Horizon offices were quiet at 8:30 p.m., the open workspace illuminated only by security lighting. I made my way to my office, a glass-enclosed space designed to embody my leadership philosophy, transparent yet defined, accessible yet purposeful. Unlike the traditional wood-paneled sanctuary my parents had maintained at Westmore, my office featured contemporary furnishings, vibrant art, and walls that could be transparent or opaque, depending on the privacy needed. I settled at my desk, intending to review some reports, but instead found myself staring at the city lights visible through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The same skyline I had gazed at that morning, yet from the opposite perspective, Horizon looking toward Westmore. Rather than the reverse, the physical embodiment of the different vantage points I now occupied simultaneously. A soft knock at the door interrupted my thoughts. Eliza stood there, coat over her arm, clearly on her way out, but pausing at the sight of me sitting alone, in the darkened office. "Working late again?" she asked, though it wasn't really a question. She knew me well enough to recognize when work was serving as a refuge rather than merely a responsibility. "Just finishing up a few things," I replied automatically. She tilted her head slightly, a gesture that conveyed gentle skepticism. "Same few things you were working on at 6 a.m. this morning?" I smiled despite myself. "Possibly." Eliza sat down, her bag, and took a seat across from me, settling in with the comfortable familiarity of someone who had earned the right to speak freely. "You've been pushing yourself even harder than usual since the acquisition. 18-hour days, working weekends, canceling your rare personal appointments. If any of your executives maintained this schedule, you'd lecture them about burnout and diminishing returns. It's a critical transition period, I countered. There are too many moving pieces to delegate everything. She made the non-committal sound that usually preceded her most incisive observations. And it has nothing to do with proving to your family that their assessment of you was not just wrong, but spectacularly, monumentally wrong. I looked away, uncomfortable with her accuracy. The acquisition was a sound business decision. Westmore has valuable client relationships, strong fundamentals. Save the board presentation for someone who hasn't worked beside you for the past 5 years, she interrupted gently. I was there when you first identified Westmore as a potential acquisition target. I saw how personal it was for you, and that was fine. The best business decisions often align professional opportunity with personal meaning. But the acquisition is complete, Alexandra. You won. The question is, what now? Now we execute the integration plan, modernize their service offerings, expand their digital capabilities. That's what the companies will do, she clarified. I'm asking what you will do. What happens to a person whose primary motivating force for 7 years has been proving others wrong once she's definitively done so? What fills the space where that drive used to live? The question echoed my own unvoiced thoughts from that first day after the acquisition. The same uncertainty that had been hovering at the edges of my consciousness during these weeks of relentless work. What did come next when the goal that had oriented my entire adult life had been achieved? I don't know, I admitted finally. I've been so focused on reaching this point that I never really thought about what would come after. Eliza nodded, understanding. May I offer an observation? One that comes from someone who cares about you beyond your role as my boss? Of course. You've proven your professional worth beyond any possible doubt. You've built multiple successful companies, executed a brilliant acquisition strategy, and now control the very organization that once rejected you. That external validation is complete and irrefutable. She paused, choosing her next words carefully. But I wonder if what remains unresolved is more personal than professional. Not whether you're capable, that question has been definitively answered, but why your capabilities weren't recognized and nurtured by the people who should have been your strongest advocates. Her insight struck with uncomfortable precision. The professional vindication was complete, yet a lingering emptiness remained. Because beneath the business achievement lay a more fundamental question. Why hadn't they believed in me? What had they seen, or failed to see, that led them to dismiss the potential that was so evident in retrospect? That's not a question I can answer through spreadsheets and strategy documents, I said quietly. No, Eliza agreed. And perhaps that's why you're working 18-hour days and sleeping in your office. Because the hard numbers and clear metrics of business performance are far more comfortable territory than the messy, unquantifiable realm of family dynamics and emotional recognition. She rose, gathering her bag once more. Just something to consider. And maybe, just maybe, something to address before you drive yourself to exhaustion pursuing validation in the professional sphere that can never quite fill the void left in the personal one. After she left, I remained at my desk, her words resonating with truths I had been avoiding. The acquisition of Westmore had been the culmination of a journey that began with professional rejection, but was rooted in something deeper, the lifelong experience of being overlooked, underestimated, and measured against standards that seemed to shift whenever I approached them. I had responded by building success so substantial it could not be dismissed, creating achievement so significant it demanded recognition. And it had worked. My parents could no longer deny my capabilities. My brother could no longer assume his birthright would trump my merit. The business world could no longer overlook my contributions. Yet beneath that professional triumph remained the wounded child who simply wanted to know, why wasn't I enough? Why did I have to achieve extraordinary Success to earn the basic recognition my brother received automatically? What had made me so easy to dismiss, to undervalue, to sideline in their vision of the future? These weren't questions that could be answered through balance sheets or market analyses. They would require a different kind of courage, the willingness to engage directly with the painful history I had channeled into professional ambition, but never truly resolved. As I finally gathered my things to head home, I realized that perhaps the greatest challenge of my acquisition wasn't the business integration, but the personal one. Reconciling the powerful leader I had become with the dismissed daughter I had been, finding a way forward that honored both without being limited by either. The victory was complete, but the journey wasn't over. It was simply entering a new phase, one that might prove more challenging, more transformative, and ultimately more rewarding than the external success I had already achieved. 6 weeks after the acquisition, I found myself facing an unanticipated challenge. The initial integration phase had proceeded largely according to plan. Departmental restructuring was underway, technology migrations had begun, and client retention remained stable despite the ownership change. The professional aspect of the transition was proceeding smoothly, even as the personal dynamics remained complex. What I hadn't anticipated was the media attention. Businessweek had somehow learned the full story behind the acquisition and was planning a feature article with the working title, "Revenge Served Corporate: How Alexandra Reed Acquired Her Parents' Company." The reporter had reached out requesting an interview, framing the piece as an inspirational story of overcoming gender bias in family business succession. I sat in my office at Westmore, staring at the email request. The narrative they proposed, talented, daughter rejected by tradition-bound parents returns triumphantly to claim her rightful place, was simplistic but not entirely inaccurate. It would certainly generate attention, potentially raising my profile as a business leader and putting Westmore Horizon in the spotlight. Yet something about it felt wrong. Not just professionally problematic, but personally uncomfortable. The story they wanted to tell reduced a complex human situation to a neat revenge narrative, flattening nuanced relationships into two-dimensional caricatures of villains and heroes. It would publicly humiliate my parents while casting me as motivated primarily by vindictiveness rather than vision. I closed the email without responding, uncertain how to proceed. My instinct was to decline the interview outright, but our PR team had already advised that proactive engagement would allow us to shape the narrative rather than merely react to it. The story would likely run with or without my participation. Weighing the pros and cons of media attention? The voice startled me. I looked up to find Eleanor Westmore standing in my doorway, my father's mother, co-founder of Westmore Solutions, and the woman whose office I now occupied. At 83, she remained formidable, tall and straight-backed, her white hair cut in a sleek bob, her eyes sharp with intelligence undimmed by age. "Grandmother," I said, surprised. "I didn't know you were in the building today." "I still keep an office on the 3rd floor," she replied, stepping into the room. "Emeritus status has its privileges. May I sit?" I nodded, gesturing to the chair across from my desk. My relationship with my grandmother had always been cordial but distant. Unlike my mother's parents, who had been warm and demonstrative, the Westmores embodied the reserved New England stoicism of their generation. I had always sensed she held me in some esteem, but she had never intervened in my parents' decisions regarding my role in the company. "So," she said once settled, appraising me with curious eyes, "you've accomplished what many considered impossible, acquired your parents' company, restructured the executive leadership, and begun implementing changes they resisted for years, all before your 31st birthday. Impressive by any standard." Her tone revealed nothing of her personal feelings about these developments. I responded cautiously. The acquisition made sound business sense. Westmore had strong fundamentals, but needed modernization to remain competitive. Yes, yes. She waved away the corporate speak impatiently. I've read the board presentations and shareholder communications. What I'm interested in is what isn't in those documents, the personal motivations behind the professional decisions. I tensed. The business case stood on its own merits. Of course it did, she agreed. You're too intelligent to pursue an acquisition without solid financial justification. But we both know there were other companies with similar profiles that would have made equally sound investments. You chose Westmore for reasons beyond the balance sheet. Her directness was unsettling, but also somewhat refreshing after weeks of careful navigation around the unspoken tensions with my parents. Still, I wasn't prepared to bare my soul to a woman I barely knew, regardless of our shared bloodline. If you're concerned about the future of the company you built, I began diplomatically. I'm not, she interrupted. The company needed exactly the shakeup you're providing. Richard and Margaret became too focused on preserving what was rather than creating what could be. Their rejection of your ideas 7 years ago was short-sighted. I told them so at the time. This revelation caught me completely by surprise. You disagreed with their decision? Vehemently. A small smile played at the corners of her mouth. We had quite the argument about it. I told them they were making a grave error in judgment based on outdated notions of leadership and succession. I struggled to process this information. For 7 years, I had assumed the entire Westmore family had united in finding me unsuitable for leadership. The idea that my grandmother had advocated for me behind the scenes shifted something in my understanding of that pivotal rejection. Why didn't you tell me? I asked finally. Her eyebrows rose slightly. Would it have made a difference? Would knowing one old woman disagreed with their assessment have changed your path? I considered the question honestly. Probably not. But it might have changed how I felt about myself during those early years. It was difficult, believing my entire family thought I lacked potential. And that belief fueled you, she observed shrewdly. It drove you to prove them wrong in the most definitive way possible. Would you have worked quite so relentlessly, pushed quite so hard, reached quite so high if you'd had the comfort of knowing someone believed in you already? The question was uncomfortable precisely because I couldn't dismiss it entirely. The pain of rejection had indeed been a powerful motivator, propelling me through exhaustion, self-doubt, and failure. Had that very pain been necessary for the success that followed? That's a rather convenient rationalization for not speaking up more forcefully, I noted, unable to keep a hint of bitterness from my voice. Perhaps, she conceded without defensiveness. Or perhaps I recognized something in you that I also saw in myself at your age, a fire that burns brightest when fighting against constraints. Some people need support to flourish, others need resistance. You struck me as the latter. I wasn't sure how to respond to this assessment. There was truth in it, but also a certain convenient absolution of responsibility. Before I could formulate a reply, she nodded toward my computer. That interview request has you troubled. You're concerned about how the story will affect the company's reputation and your family's. I shouldn't have been surprised that she knew about the Business Week request. Eleanor Westmore had always maintained an uncanny awareness of developments within her company, even years after her official retirement. The narrative they want to tell is simplistic, I explained. Wronged daughter takes revenge on parents who underestimated her. It's not accurate, and it's not the image I want for either Westmore or Horizon. Yet there's enough truth in it to make outright denial impossible, she observed. Yes. She studied me thoughtfully. You care about protecting your parents' dignity, even after how they treated you. That's unexpected. Is it? I challenged. Believing I was wronged doesn't mean I want to publicly humiliate them. Success was the goal. Retribution never was. A slow smile spread across her face, the first genuine expression of warmth I could recall seeing from her. Then you've already answered your own question about the interview, haven't you? She was right, I realized. My hesitation about the interview wasn't just professional calculation, but an authentic reflection of my values. Despite everything, I didn't want my success to come at the cost of my parents' public embarrassment. Whatever reckoning needed to happen between us should occur privately, not in the pages of a national business magazine. I'll decline the interview, I decided. We'll issue a standard statement about the acquisition being a strategic alignment of complementary businesses, emphasizing the continuity of the Westmore legacy rather than the change in ownership. A mature decision, she approved, and one that reveals more about your character than perhaps you realize. I looked at her quizzically, and she continued, Success can be attained through many paths, but how we handle success, that reveals who we truly are. Many in your position would seize the opportunity to publicly triumph over those who doubted them. Your restraint suggests you've achieved something more valuable than mere vindication. Which is? Perspective, she replied simply. The understanding. That genuine success isn't about proving others wrong, but about building something right. Something that stands on its own merits rather than in opposition to others' expectations. Her words resonated more deeply than I wanted to admit. For years, I had defined my goals in reactive terms, proving my parents wrong, demonstrating capabilities they had failed to recognize, achieving what they said I couldn't. Even as I built Horizon and pursued increasingly ambitious business objectives, that oppositional energy had remained a primary driver. Now, having achieved the ultimate vindication, I found myself at an unexpected crossroads. What would drive me forward now that the need to prove myself had been satisfied? What would success look like when it was no longer defined against others' doubts? Richard and Margaret made a critical error in how they assessed you, my grandmother continued. But they're not evil people, just flawed ones with blind spots shaped by their own experiences and limitations. Just as you have yours, and I have mine. I bristled slightly at the implication. My blind spots didn't result in crushing someone else's dreams. Didn't they? Her gaze was piercing. What about Jackson? Have your actions toward him been entirely free of the very bias you resented in your parents? The question struck uncomfortably close to my recent realization about how I had been treating my brother. I had indeed held him to standards I hadn't clearly articulated, found fault with work that others had deemed acceptable, made him constantly prove his worth while conveying skepticism about his capabilities. Exactly what had wounded me so deeply. When I was the one being judged, my silence was answer enough. Eleanor nodded with understanding rather than judgment. Hurt travels through generations until someone chooses to bear it rather than transmit it. Your parents repeated patterns they learned from their own experiences, your mother particularly. Did you know she was passed over for partnership at her first firm, despite having the strongest client portfolio? They promoted 2 less qualified men instead, telling her she wasn't leadership material. I hadn't known this. My mother never spoke of her early career challenges. She had always presented herself as someone who succeeded through discipline and adherence to established norms, never as someone who had faced similar barriers to the ones she later placed in my path. That doesn't excuse what she did, I said, though with less certainty than before. No, it doesn't, my grandmother agreed. Explanation isn't the same as justification, but understanding the patterns might help you break them rather than simply reverse who occupies which position within them. She rose from her chair with the deliberate care of someone managing arthritic joints without wanting to appear diminished by them. I've said my piece. Take it for what it's worth. The perspective of someone who built a company, made countless mistakes along the way, and had the dubious privilege of watching 2 generations navigate the complex intersection of family and business. At the door, she paused and turned back. By the way, your digital transformation strategy for the Latimer account is excellent. Exactly what Warren needs. though he's too stubborn to admit it yet. I told him as much at our monthly bridge game last week. He'll come around. With that parting comment, revealing both her continuing influence with key clients and her surprising support of my strategic vision, she departed, leaving me with much to consider. I spent the rest of the afternoon responding to emails and reviewing project timelines, but my grandmother's words continued to circulate in my thoughts. Particularly striking was her observation about patterns, how easily we can find ourselves, perpetuating the very dynamics we once resented, simply with the positions reversed. Had I been doing exactly that with Jackson? The question demanded honest examination. When I reviewed our interactions since the acquisition, I recognized a pattern of holding him to shifting standards, of viewing his work through a lens of preconceived judgment, of making him earn approval I freely gave to others in similar positions. It wasn't that his work was beyond criticism. The initial Miller presentation had genuinely lacked the depth the client required. But my approach to that criticism, my underlying skepticism about his capabilities, my subtle satisfaction in watching him struggle, these reflected something beyond professional assessment. They revealed the wounded part of me that wanted him to experience the doubt and frustration I had endured. The realization was uncomfortable, but necessary. If I truly believed my parents had been wrong in how they treated me, then perpetuating the same dynamic with Jackson betrayed my own values. Breaking the pattern required more than simply inverting who held power over whom. It demanded establishing a completely different basis for relationship and evaluation. With this clarity came the beginning of a broader perspective shift. Perhaps my entire framing of success as validation, as proving wrong those who had doubted me, had been unnecessarily limiting. It had served its purpose, providing motivation during difficult early years when external recognition was scarce. But now that I had achieved the ultimate professional vindication, perhaps it was time to define success in affirmative rather than reactive terms. What did I want to build, not to prove others wrong, but because I believed in its intrinsic value? What vision would energize me not because it contradicted others' assessment of my limitations, but because it aligned with my deepest values and aspirations? These questions felt both daunting and liberating, marking the transition from a success defined by rejection to one characterized by authentic purpose. It wouldn't happen overnight, this shift in orientation. The habits of thinking and motivation, formed over 7 years, wouldn't transform in an instant. But recognizing the need for change was the essential first step. The following morning, I arrived at Westmore earlier than usual, hoping to catch Jackson before the day's meetings began. I found him in his office, already reviewing client materials with the same intensity I had observed during our pre-dawn encounter weeks earlier. He looked up when I knocked on his open door, his expression guarded. "Alexandra, did we have a meeting scheduled?" "No," I replied, stepping into the office. "I wanted to speak with you privately before the day gets underway. Do you have a few minutes?" His eyebrows rose slightly in surprise, but he nodded, gesturing to a chair across from his desk. I closed the door before sitting, signaling the personal rather than professional nature of the conversation. "I owe you an apology," I began directly, watching his expression shift from guardedness to confusion. "Since the acquisition, I've been evaluating your work through a biased lens. I've held you to standards I didn't clearly articulate and approached your contributions with a skepticism that says more about my history with our parents than about your actual capabilities." He stared at me, clearly trying to determine if this was some kind of test or trap. "That's not what I expected you to say." "I imagine not, but it's true, and I'm sorry. The Miller presentation revisions were a case in point. The original version did need improvement, but my feedback was unnecessarily harsh and my standards unnecessarily ambiguous. I put you in a position where success seemed deliberately unattainable, exactly what I resented most about how our parents treated me." Understanding dawned in his expression. You've been doing to me what they did to you. Yes, I admitted. Not consciously, at least not at first. But the pattern is unmistakable once I was willing to see it. He leaned back in his chair, studying me with new curiosity. What changed? Why the sudden self-awareness? I considered how much to share about my conversation with our grandmother, ultimately deciding on transparency. Eleanor Westmore pointed out my blind spot. She suggested that hurt travels through generations until someone chooses to bear it rather than transmit it. I've been transmitting the hurt I experienced, just with the power dynamics reversed. Jackson absorbed this, then laughed softly, not mockingly, but with genuine amusement. Grandmother always did have an unsettling ability to cut straight through to the core of things. She reduced Dad to stunned silence more than once when I was growing up. I wish I had known her better, I said, realizing how little relationship I'd had with this insightful woman who shared both my bloodline and, apparently, my business perspective. She paid attention to you, you know, Jackson revealed. More than you probably realized. She would ask about your career moves, your companies. I think she was keeping tabs on you all along. This new information reinforced the sense that I had misunderstood key aspects of my family's perception of me. Perhaps the rejection hadn't been as universal as I had believed. The assessment of my limitations not as unanimous as it had seemed, in that painful moment 7 years ago. I'd like to start over, I said, returning to the purpose of my visit. Not ignoring the past, but not letting it dictate our future working relationship either. I'll provide clear expectations and evaluate your work on its merits, not against some shifting standard designed to prove a point. Jackson considered this, his natural skepticism evident. And what exactly do you want from me in return for this fresh start? Unquestioning loyalty? Public acknowledgement that you deserve the leadership role I was being groomed for? The questions were fair, given our history. I don't want anything from you except professional engagement with the work itself, I answered honestly. Whether you choose to trust this change in approach is entirely up to you. I'm offering different behavior moving forward, not demanding a particular response to it. He studied me for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Okay, a professional reset. I can work with that. After a brief pause, he added with the hint of a smile, though I reserve the right to remain suspicious until proven otherwise. Fair. Enough, I agreed, rising from my chair. Your revised Miller presentation was excellent, by the way. Genuinely excellent. Not just meets expectations. The client specifically commented on the depth of analysis in the implementation timeline. His surprise at the straightforward praise was evident, but he recovered quickly. Thanks. I've been thinking about how we might apply a similar approach to the Dennison account. They have comparable legacy systems issues that are creating supply chain vulnerabilities. I'd be interested in seeing your thoughts on that, I said, meaning, it odds perhaps we could discuss it after you've had time to develop the concept further. As I turned to leave, he called after me, Alexandra? I paused at the door, looking back questioningly. For what it's worth, I never thought you weren't capable. I just never questioned the path they laid out because it benefited me. That was selfish, and I'm not particularly proud of it in retrospect. The admission caught me off guard, a small but significant bridging of the gulf that had separated us for years. Thank you for saying that, I replied simply, not wanting to overstate the moment's significance but acknowledging its value. Walking back to my office, I felt a subtle shift in my internal landscape, a loosening of something that had been tightly wound for so long, I had stopped noticing its constant pressure. The conversation with Jackson hadn't resolved everything, nor had it erased the complex history between us, but it represented a step toward something different, a relationship defined by current choices rather than past wounds. More broadly, it confirmed the emerging realization that had begun with my grandmother's observations. True success might require letting go of the very narrative that had driven me to this point. Not forgetting the lessons learned through struggle, but transforming how those experiences informed my path forward. The company-wide integration meeting scheduled for 10 a.m. awaited, followed by client calls and strategy sessions that would fill the remainder of the day. But as I prepared my notes, I felt a clarity that had been elusive during the weeks since the acquisition. The path forward wasn't about continuing to prove my value. That question had been definitively answered. It was about creating value, beyond validation, building something worthy, not because it contradicted others' assessment of my limitations, but because it expressed my authentic vision. For 7 years, I had climbed a mountain with the singular goal of proving I could reach its summit. Now, standing at that hard-won peak, I could finally look beyond it to the range of possibilities that stretched toward the horizon. Possibilities that had always been there but had remained obscured by my focus on the immediate challenge. The real journey, I was beginning to understand, wasn't the climb up the mountain of vindication. It was what came next. The uncharted territory beyond validation, where success would be measured not by what I proved to others, but by what I created, from the unique perspective I had earned. 3 months after acquiring Westmore Solutions, I found myself facing a milestone I hadn't anticipated reaching so quickly. The integration of the two companies had progressed ahead of schedule, with technology systems successfully merged, organizational structures realigned, and client retention far exceeding our projections. What had initially been estimated as a 6-month transition had been largely accomplished in half that time, creating space to focus on growth rather than mere consolidation. This success brought with it an unexpected challenge: the need to articulate a forward-looking vision for the combined entity. The leadership team had gathered in Horizon's conference room for a full-day strategic planning session to define our next chapter. The energy in the room was palpable, a mixture of accomplishment for what we had achieved and anticipation for what lay ahead. "The integration metrics are exceptional," Diana reported, presenting the final slides of her update. "Client satisfaction has actually increased by 7% since the acquisition, likely due to the enhanced digital capabilities we've introduced. Employee retention is at 92%, well above industry standard for post-acquisition periods. And the Latimer Group has not only renewed their contract, but expanded it to include the supply chain modernization they initially resisted." That last point represented a particular triumph. Warren Latimer had indeed come around, as my grandmother predicted, especially after seeing the successful implementation of similar strategies with 3 other manufacturing clients. My parents' relationship with him had proven valuable in managing the transition, just as my mother had suggested. It was one of many instances where the combination of their traditional approach and my innovative vision had created something stronger than either would have achieved alone. "These results validate our acquisition thesis," Eliza observed. "The fundamentals were sound. The company just needed modernization and fresh perspective." I nodded in agreement, but found myself reflecting on how my understanding of that acquisition thesis had evolved over these months. What had begun as a transaction motivated significantly by personal vindication had transformed into something more complex and ultimately more rewarding. A genuine business synergy that created value beyond mere ownership transfer. "So what's next?" Marcus, our CFO, asked the question that hung in the air. "We've successfully combined the companies. Where do we go from here?" All eyes turned to me, waiting for the vision that would guide our collective efforts moving forward. 3 months earlier, I might have framed that vision primarily in terms of market dominance, aggressive growth metrics, or competitive positioning, external measurements that would further validate my leadership capabilities. Now, I found myself considering a different kind of success, one defined less by what we could prove to others and more by what we could create together. "Before I answer that," I began, "I'd like us to consider a more fundamental question. Why does this company exist? Not how it came to be, or what it does, but why it matters that we do this work in the world. The question seemed to catch the team by surprise. We had always been focused on clear business objectives, market share, revenue targets, client acquisition. This more philosophical inquiry represented a departure from our usual strategic discussions. We help businesses optimize their operations and embrace digital transformation, Diana offered after a moment. That's what we do, I acknowledged, but not why we do it. What difference does it make that we do this work well? Why should anyone, beyond our shareholders and employees, care whether we succeed? The room fell silent as the team considered the question. Finally, Samir, our head of client solutions, spoke up. When we do our best work, we help organizations navigate change that would otherwise destroy them. We preserve jobs that would be lost to obsolescence. We help traditional businesses remain relevant and competitive in a rapidly evolving marketplace. His perspective shifted the conversation from mechanics to meaning, from process to purpose. Others began to contribute their thoughts. We translate between established business wisdom and emerging technological possibilities. We help bridge generational gaps within organizations. We enable sustainable transformation rather than disruptive replacement. As these reflections continued, I could see a deeper understanding of our collective purpose beginning to emerge. Not just what services we provided, but what human needs those services addressed. This is exactly the kind of thinking we need to inform our next chapter, I said, when the initial wave of contributions had subsided. Because I believe we're at an inflection point, not just as a company, but as an economy. The tension between established business models and technological disruption is creating widespread uncertainty. Organizations are struggling to determine what to preserve and what to transform. They need partners who understand both the value of tradition and the necessity of innovation. I moved to the whiteboard, beginning to sketch out the framework that had been taking shape in my mind over recent weeks. What if our next phase isn't just about growing larger, but about growing deeper? What if instead of simply expanding our client base, we developed a more comprehensive approach to transformation, one that addresses not just systems and processes, but culture, leadership development, and sustainable adaptation? Over the next 2 hours, the vision became increasingly concrete. We identified gaps in current consulting frameworks that created opportunities for our unique combination of traditional consulting expertise and digital innovation capabilities. We mapped potential service offerings that would integrate human and technological elements of transformation. We outlined research initiatives that would position us as thought leaders rather than merely service providers. This isn't just incremental growth, Eliza observed as the session neared its conclusion. It's a fundamental evolution in how we define our value proposition. Exactly, I confirmed. And it builds on the specific insight we've gained through the integration process, that the most powerful transformation doesn't replace traditional strengths, but amplifies them through strategic innovation. As the team filed out for a well-deserved lunch break, Eliza remained behind, studying the whiteboard with its ambitious vision for the future. This is different from what you would have proposed 6 months ago, she observed quietly. I nodded, recognizing the truth in her assessment. 6 months ago, I was still trying to prove I deserved a seat at the table. Now I'm more interested in what we can create together at that table. It's a more powerful position, she said, leading from vision rather than validation. Her observation crystallized the shift that had been occurring gradually but definitively in my approach to leadership. I had moved from seeing success primarily as vindication to understanding it as contribution, from proving my worth to creating value that extended beyond myself. I'd like to present this vision to the full executive team tomorrow, I decided, including my parents in their advisory capacity. Their perspective on how this will be received by traditional clients would be valuable. Eliza raised her eyebrows slightly, noting the significance of this inclusion. In previous strategy discussions, I had been careful to maintain separation between innovation planning and my parents' involvement, concerned that their traditional outlook might constrain bold thinking. This represented a new willingness to integrate perspectives rather than simply replace one with another. The presentation to the expanded executive team the following morning generated precisely the dynamic exchange I had hoped for. The Horizon executives brought energetic innovation to the discussion, while the Westmore veterans contributed crucial insights about implementation challenges and client readiness. My father, in particular, offered valuable perspective on how to sequence the introduction of new services to minimize disruption while maximizing adoption. Most surprising was Jackson's contribution. Rather than the defensive posture he might have adopted earlier, he engaged thoughtfully with the vision, identifying specific client relationships that were primed for this expanded approach. He had clearly given significant thought to how traditional consulting models needed to evolve, demonstrating an understanding of market dynamics I hadn't previously credited him with possessing. As the meeting concluded, a sense of aligned purpose filled the room, a shared commitment to something larger than individual advancement or departmental dominance. The vision had created a space where diverse perspectives could contribute to a common goal, where the tension between tradition and innovation became creative rather than competitive. My mother approached as the group dispersed, her expression thoughtful. "This is ambitious," she observed. "It positions us beyond the traditional consulting category entirely." "That's the intention," I confirmed. "The market doesn't need another conventional consulting firm with a digital veneer. It needs partners who can genuinely bridge different worlds." She nodded slowly. "It's not how your father and I would have evolved the company. We would have been more cautious, more incremental." She paused, meeting my eyes directly. "But I believe your approach is better suited to the current environment. The pace of change requires bolder vision than was necessary in our time." Coming. From Margaret Reed, this represented extraordinary acknowledgement. She had built her career and reputation on measured strategy and careful expansion. To recognize the validity of a fundamentally different approach, and to acknowledge its superiority for current conditions, demonstrated remarkable adaptability for someone who had spent decades advocating a particular business philosophy. "Thank you," I replied simply. "I value your perspective on how we communicate this evolution to long-standing clients. They trust your judgment in ways they don't yet trust mine." "They will," she said with unexpected certainty. "Results build trust more effectively than history. Your results are becoming difficult to dismiss, even for the most tradition-bound clients." Later that afternoon, I found myself drawn to the rooftop garden of the Westmore building, a space I had discovered during my second week after the acquisition. Originally created as a smoking area in the 1960s, it had been transformed by a previous facilities manager into a modest but pleasant green space. Few employees knew of its existence, making it an ideal retreat for solitary reflection. The city stretched before me, buildings catching the late afternoon sunlight, streets filled with the steady flow of people moving purposefully toward their various destinations. Somewhere in that landscape, 7 years earlier, a younger version of myself had left the Westmore offices with tears barely contained, determined to prove her worth despite a devastating rejection. That determination had indeed driven remarkable achievement, the building of not one but multiple successful companies, the acquisition of the very firm that had dismissed her potential, the definitive demonstration of capabilities her parents had failed to recognize. Yet standing here now, with that validation complete and irrefutable, I could see both the power and the limitation of vindication as a motivating force. It had provided essential energy during difficult early years, when external recognition was scarce. It had pushed me to exceed conventional expectations and pursue ambitious goals others might have abandoned. It had, in many ways, contributed directly to the success I now enjoyed. Yet vindication alone created an inherently limited horizon. one that ended at the moment of proof, that culminated in the reversal of others' judgment rather than the creation of enduring value. Had I remained solely focused on proving my parents wrong, I might have acquired Westmore only to dismantle it, replacing rather than transforming what they had built. I might have excluded them entirely rather than finding ways to integrate their valuable perspectives. I might have repeated with Jackson the very patterns of dismissal and conditional approval that had wounded me so deeply. The path beyond vindication, the leadership that emerged from validation rather than seeking it, offered something far more meaningful: the opportunity to create rather than merely prove, to build rather than simply demonstrate, to define success, on my own terms rather than in opposition to others' definitions. My phone buzzed with a message from Eleanor Westmore. "Have time for tea tomorrow? There are some historical perspectives on the Latimer relationship that might be useful as you expand their contract." I smiled at the transparency of her pretense. The message wasn't really about Latimer. It was an invitation to continue the mentorship she had begun offering. Wisdom I now recognized as valuable precisely because it came from someone who understood both where I had been and where I was going. 3 p.m. works for me, I replied. I value your insights. As I turned to head back inside, the door to the rooftop opened and my father emerged, looking momentarily surprised to find me there. "I wasn't aware anyone else knew about this spot," he said, hesitating at the threshold. "I discovered it a few weeks ago," I explained. "It's become a favorite thinking place." He nodded, understanding immediately. Richard Reed had always been a man who valued solitude for reflection, a trait I had inherited but only recently come to appreciate as a strength rather than a limitation. "I can come back later," he offered. "No need," I replied, gesturing him forward. "I was just finishing up." He joined me at the railing, both of us looking out at the city in silence for a moment. During the 3 months since the acquisition, our interactions had remained primarily professional, cordial but careful, focused on specific business matters rather than the deeper currents of our relationship. The personal reckoning I had anticipated hadn't materialized, replaced instead by a cautious mutual accommodation. "Your strategic vision today was impressive," he said finally. "Particularly the way you integrated technological innovation with human-centered consulting principles. It's a more nuanced approach than I would have expected." "Than you would have expected from me specifically or from someone of my generation generally?" I asked, keeping my tone curious rather than confrontational. He considered the question seriously. "Both, I suppose. Those of us who built careers in traditional consulting often view technology-focused approaches as lacking depth, prioritizing novelty over substance. And you specifically." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Your early proposals emphasized disruption in ways that seemed to dismiss the value of established methodologies. This new vision is more integrative." "I've learned a few things since those early proposals," I acknowledged, "including the fact that effective transformation preserves what works while evolving what doesn't. Complete disruption creates unnecessary resistance and loses valuable institutional knowledge." He turned to look at me directly, something vulnerable in his expression that I rarely witnessed. "I've been thinking about when you presented your ideas after completing your MBA, the modernization plan we rejected. There was merit in those proposals that I failed to recognize at the time. My response was unnecessarily dismissive." The acknowledgement was unexpected, particularly from my father, who had always found it difficult to admit error. It wasn't a full apology, but it represented a significant concession from a man who had built his professional identity on being the expert whose judgment didn't require validation. "What would you have done differently?" I asked, genuinely curious rather than seeking further vindication. "If you could go back to that moment?" He seemed surprised by the question, perhaps having expected either immediate forgiveness or continued resentment. "I would have engaged with your ideas rather than dismissing them outright," he said after a moment of reflection. "I would have asked questions instead of making assumptions about your reasoning. I might still have disagreed with certain elements, but I would have treated the proposal, and you, with the respect they deserved." His answer revealed an understanding of what had hurt most about that rejection. Not the disagreement itself, but the dismissal of my capabilities without genuine consideration of my ideas. The assumption that I couldn't possibly have insights worth serious engagement. "For what it's worth," he continued when I didn't immediately respond, "that failure of judgment says far more about my limitations than yours. I was protecting a vision of the company and a vision of leadership that I understood. Your approach represented uncertainty I wasn't prepared to embrace." As he spoke, I recognized something I had missed in my years of focusing on this rejection as evidence of my parents' flawed assessment of me specifically. Their response hadn't been solely about me at all. It had been equally about their relationship to change, their comfort with established patterns, their struggle to envision a future significantly different from the past they had navigated successfully. This realization didn't erase the hurt of that moment, or the years of striving it had initiated, but it contextualized the rejection in a way that made it less personal, less about my inherent worth, and more about the universal challenge of embracing unfamiliar possibilities. "I appreciate you saying that," I said finally. "It changes how I understand what happened between us." He nodded, turning back to the cityscape. "Your mother and I discussed it recently. How differently things might have unfolded if we had recognized your potential, then rather than being forced to acknowledge it now. Whether you would have evolved into the leader you've become if we had smoothed your path rather than obstructing it." The question echoed my grandmother's observation about adversity as a catalyst, resistance as a strengthening force. Would I have developed the same capabilities, the same resilience, the same clarity of purpose if my journey had been easier? It was impossible to know with certainty, but the question itself reflected a new willingness to consider complexity rather than clinging to simplistic narratives. "I've been thinking about legacy," I said, shifting to the broader implications of our shared history. Not just what we inherit, but what we create, what we pass forward rather than what we receive. "And what conclusions have you reached?" he asked. "That the most valuable legacy isn't a company or an achievement, but a set of values that transcend specific circumstances. The companies we build will evolve or eventually disappear. The particular innovations we introduce will be superseded by others. But how we approach challenges, how we treat people, how we define success, those influences can extend far beyond any organizational structure." He considered this thoughtfully. "It's why your mother and I place such emphasis on stability and tradition. We believed those values would provide security through changing conditions. Perhaps we failed to recognize equally important values of adaptability and innovation. Or perhaps different eras call for different primary values." This nuanced reflection represented significant evolution from the rigid certainty that had characterized his earlier position. Not a complete reversal, but an opening to more complex understanding, an acknowledgement that multiple perspectives might contain validity rather than a single approach representing absolute truth. "I think it's less about which values are correct, and more about how they balance and complement each other," I suggested. "Stability without innovation becomes stagnation. Innovation without stability becomes chaos. The wisdom lies in discerning when to preserve and when to transform." He nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "When did you become so philosophical? The Alexandra I remember was all about action and challenge, not reflection and integration." "Somewhere between building companies and buying yours," I replied with matching lightness. "Turns out succeeding doesn't automatically provide the answers I thought it would. It just raises more interesting questions. We stood in comfortable silence for a moment, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the rooftop garden. Something had shifted between us. Not dramatic reconciliation or complete resolution, but a tentative step toward genuine communication rather than the careful performance of professional roles. The executive committee meets tomorrow to finalize the implementation timeline for the new strategic direction, I said eventually, returning to business matters. Your perspective on client readiness would be valuable if you're available to join. I'll be there, he confirmed. And Alexandra? I looked at him questioningly. I'm proud of what you've built, not just the business success, impressive. As that is, but the leader you've become, the vision you've developed. You've created something significant, something that matters beyond profit margins and market share. Coming from Richard Reed, this represented extraordinary acknowledgement, not just of my professional accomplishments, but of the values and purpose that informed them. It was the recognition I had sought for so long, yet its arrival now felt less like validation and more like connection, a bridge across the divide that had separated us for years. Thank you, I said simply. That means more than you might realize. As we made our way back inside, I reflected on the unexpected journey these past months had represented. I had acquired Westmore seeking vindication, but had discovered something far more valuable. The opportunity to create a legacy that transcended the wounds of the past, that integrated multiple perspectives into something stronger than any could have produced alone, that defined success not by what had been proven, but by what could be built. The path forward wasn't about continuing to demonstrate my worth. That question had been definitively answered. It was about creating worth beyond myself, about building something that would outlast the particular circumstances of its creation, about defining success not by comparison to others' expectations, but by alignment with my deepest values. 7 years ago, a rejection had set me on a path driven primarily by the need to prove others wrong. That motivation had served its purpose, fueling achievement that might otherwise have seemed impossible. But standing now at the summit of that hard-won mountain, I could finally look beyond it to horizons that had always existed, but remained obscured by my focus on the immediate challenge. The most meaningful journeys, I was discovering, don't end with vindication. They begin there. 1 year after acquiring Westmore Solutions, I stood at the podium in the grand ballroom of the Meridian Hotel, surveying the gathered crowd of employees, clients, and industry leaders. The anniversary celebration had drawn over 400 attendees, a testament to the successful integration and subsequent growth of the combined organization, now officially rebranded as Westmore Horizon. A year ago, I began, we brought together two companies with different histories, different strengths, and different approaches to solving business challenges. Many expected a clash of cultures, a painful transition, or at best, a gradual adjustment period. What emerged instead was something none of us fully anticipated, a genuine synergy that has produced innovation beyond what either organization could have achieved independently. The metrics supported this assessment. Revenue had increased by 38% year over year. Client retention stood at 97%, while employee satisfaction had reached the highest levels in either company's history. The market had responded accordingly. Our stock price had doubled since the acquisition announcement, and industry analysts now referenced the Westmore Horizon model as a template for integrating traditional consulting strengths with digital innovation capabilities. This success stems not from erasing differences but from leveraging them, I continued. Not from replacement, but from integration. Not from imposing a single vision, but from creating space for multiple perspectives, to contribute to a shared purpose. As I delivered the remainder of my address, highlighting key milestones and recognizing outstanding contributions from team members at all levels, I was struck by how my own narrative had evolved. A year earlier, standing before the Westmore staff immediately after the acquisition, I had been primarily focused on proving my capabilities, demonstrating that I deserved the leadership position my parents had once denied me. Now that need for validation had receded, replaced by genuine excitement about what we were building together. Following the formal presentation, the event transitioned to a celebratory reception. I moved through the room, engaging in conversations with employees from both legacy organizations, clients who had been with us through the transition, and industry peers curious about our remarkable growth trajectory. Near the bar, I encountered Warren Latimer deep in conversation with my grandmother. At 84, Eleanor Westmore remained a formidable presence, her mind as sharp as her tailoring. She had become an unexpected ally over the past year, offering valuable counsel during challenging moments and perspective that bridged different eras of business thinking. "Alexandra," she called, gesturing me over. "Warren was just telling me about the manufacturing efficiency gains they've experienced since implementing your supply chain modernization strategy. Apparently, they've reduced inventory carrying costs by 34% while improving fulfillment rates." Warren, a traditionalist who had initially resisted our digital transformation recommendations, now nodded enthusiastically. "Your team found the perfect balance, leveraging our existing strengths while addressing bottlenecks we didn't even recognize. The results have exceeded our most optimistic projections. The credit belongs to our integrated consulting teams," I replied truthfully. The combination of deep industry knowledge from the Westmore side with technological expertise from Horizon created solutions neither could have developed independently. "That may be true," Warren acknowledged, "but integration doesn't happen without leadership that values both perspectives. From what I've observed, that starts at the top." His comment reflected a broader truth about the past year. The successful merger hadn't occurred spontaneously or inevitably. It had required intentional cultivation of an organizational culture that genuinely valued diverse approaches. This wasn't merely a matter of policies or procedures, but of modeling the integration I wanted to see throughout the company. As the evening progressed, I found myself gravitating toward a quiet corner of the ballroom, taking a moment to observe the celebration from a slight distance. My parents were engaged in animated conversation with several longtime clients, my father gesturing expressively as he explained some point to the group. Jackson stood nearby with Diana and several other executives from our technology division, looking more at ease than I could remember seeing him at corporate functions. "Quite the triumph," Eliza commented, appearing beside me with 2 glasses of champagne. She handed one to me, raising her own in a subtle toast. "From hostile takeover to harmonious partnership in 12 months. Not the outcome most would have predicted." "Including me," I admitted. I expected to prove my capability by imposing a new vision. Instead, I've learned more from integration than I ever would have from replacement. "That's the difference between leadership as dominance and leadership as orchestration," she observed. "The former demonstrates power, the latter creates it." Her distinction resonated with my evolving understanding of effective leadership. The past year had taught me that true influence didn't come from positional authority alone, but from the ability to create contexts where diverse talents could contribute to shared outcomes. My role wasn't simply to direct, but to design spaces where collaboration could flourish. "Speaking of orchestration," Eliza continued, nodding toward the entrance, where a latecomer had just arrived. "Your new suitor has made an appearance." I followed her gaze to see Gabriel Chen, CEO of Meridian Innovation Partners, scanning the room with evident purpose. At 42, Gabriel had established himself as one of the most respected venture capitalists in the technology sector, known for identifying promising startups and providing not just funding, but strategic guidance that accelerated their growth. Our firms had collaborated on several projects over the past 6 months, leading to increasingly frequent interaction between us as leaders. "He's not my suitor," I corrected, though I couldn't prevent a slight smile. "We have mutual business interests. Nothing more." Eliza's raised eyebrow conveyed eloquent skepticism. Is that why he's attended 3 industry events in the past month that he would normally delegate to his team? Or why our preliminary meetings suddenly require CEO presence on both sides? Before I could formulate a suitable response, Gabriel spotted us and made his way across the room. He moved with the quiet confidence of someone comfortable in his own skin, neither the aggressive assertiveness of those with something to prove, nor the careful self-consciousness of those afraid to make mistakes. "Congratulations on the anniversary," he said as he reached us. "The transformation you've achieved in 12 months is remarkable. Industry analysts are still trying to figure out how you managed such seamless integration." "We're still figuring that out ourselves," I replied honestly. "But I believe it has something to do with approaching differences as complementary rather than competitive." He nodded, understanding immediately. The both and perspective rather than either or. I've observed similar dynamics in successful mergers, though rarely executed as effectively as yours. Eliza, after exchanging pleasantries, tactfully excused herself to address an issue with the catering staff, leaving Gabriel and me in relatively private conversation despite the crowded room. "I didn't expect to see you here tonight," I said. "I thought you were in Singapore this week for the Asia-Pacific Technology Summit." "I was," he confirmed. "Flew back this morning specifically for this event. Some milestones deserve personal recognition rather than formal emails." The gesture touched me more than I wanted to admit. In the year since the acquisition, I had focused almost exclusively on professional matters, building the integrated company, establishing our new market position, developing the expanded service offerings we had envisioned in that initial strategy session. Personal relationships, already a secondary priority during my years of driven career building, had receded even further into the background. Yet recently, I had begun to recognize the limitations of that singular focus. Professional achievement, however substantial, provided an incomplete foundation for a fully realized life. The validation I had sought for so long had finally been secured, but that accomplishment had revealed the need for connection and purpose beyond the business realm. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.